we strongly support that the United States federal government should lift all or most of its sanctions on Venezuela. Definitions are contextual. I think most of us know what we're talking about. The plan, end all imposed sanctions on Venezuela, the United States federal government, as soon as possible through normal ways and means. There's something important to know. What are the issues currently going on with Venezuela? There's two key issues going on right now. First, the current president is refusing to abdicate under a lawful procedure. In other words, the head of their equivalent of Congress used a rule in order to take power for a month, but the president is refusing to give up power to said congressman. It's a confusing situation all around. The second most important issue to know, also that's the cause of US sanctions, by the way, right now in the status quo. The second important thing to note is what's happening in Venezuela is the largest economic crisis they've suffered. Like, point blank period, almost the entirety of the 30 million people living in Venezuela are suffering, with millions having to already flee or are currently under threat of death due to famine. Okay, the value for this round, or how you should evaluate it, is net benefits, the greatest good for the greatest number of people. 3 reasons. First, that's the most fair. Like, it includes everything. Second, it's the most predictable. And third, it is the easiest to debate and the easiest to evaluate. Again, something key to note here is that sacrificing others for ideals you hold is not net beneficial. And I know that sounds kind of strange to say right now, but it might come up later in the round. Sacrificing others for your ideals is not net beneficial. Moving on to our contentions. Contention 1. Sanctions don't do anything to curb or stop the behavior of governments, specifically Venezuela. Sanctions, historically, just don't work. Emily Cash reports that in terms of changing behavior, sanctions have a very poor track record at best. At worst, they've never been effective. This isn't just in general, though. This is the same thing that we've seen over the past decade with Venezuela. CNN reports that expanding the current sanctions will do little to change anything, just as the current sanctions and past ones have changed next to nothing. This isn't even the worst of it. The worst of it is that we continue to believe the same flawed strategy will work maybe the 3rd or 4th time we do it. World Finance reports that the longer sanctions are in place, the less likely they are to be effective, as the target tends to adapt to its new economic circumstances. What does that mean? Well, sanctions are quite simply a way to limit economic output. However, if in place for over a decade, which Venezuelan sanctions by the U.S. have been, since 2008 U.S. Treasury, the target country tends to do 3 things. First, they tend to adapt. Again, remember that they've had a decade to adapt to the sanctions. Guess what hasn't happened in the decade? I'll give you a hint. It hasn't stopped Venezuela from being oppressive. It hasn't stopped their current regime, and it won't. To do the same thing twice and expect a different response, a different outcome, is flawed policy. Second, U.S. sanctions won't stop Venezuela because Venezuela doesn't rely on the U.S. economy. Now, what do I mean specifically by this? What I mean here is what we see in the status quo, where Russia is filling in for any holes that the United States leaves by implementing sanctions. Forbes reports that it's difficult to imagine a scenario where Russia cuts off aid to Maduro, the current president. And why is that? Well, we know that when we recently implemented oil sanctions on the largest company, PVP, I want to say, Russia bailed them out. Russia provided the crude oil that was necessary for the Venezuelan company to mix with their light oil in order to export it. So, I'm sorry, I got a little ahead of myself. Let me explain that. The biggest reliance that the Venezuelan economy has in the United States is to import oil that they can then mix with their oil and sell back. However, the United States implemented sanctions on the prevention of that oil, so Russia stepped in and filled its spot. It also stepped in as currently the major stockholder of Venezuela's state-run oil company. So, in other words, Russia is sponsoring Venezuela's economy. Moving on to contention 2. Sanctions don't just solve anything, they worsen the situation. Yang Li of Stanford University writes, as sanctions increase, the regional inequality between the capital and more rural areas increases as well. In other words, the sanctions don't harm the regime. Rather, they inflict adverse humanitarian consequences on civilians, end quote. New York Times finds the same thing with recent Venezuelan sanctions, saying that they, quote, will push the already suffering citizens into a greater humanitarian crisis. Sorry, I had trouble reading my writing. Why is this? Or, well, here, let me address the fact first. The New York Times further concludes that these sanctions will lead to a 26% reduction in the entirety of the economy of Venezuela, equivalent to a total economic collapse. We're talking about a regime that lives by harming and inflicting suffering on others in order to support itself. That's not going to change just because of sanctions. Now, I know sanctions sound good in that they put strain on the economy. They put strain on the state-run company. But how does a company respond? It's simple. They try to maximize profit by all means necessary. That's what its current government's done. It's done 3 things to respond to sanctions, which are extremely harmful for the citizens. First, it freezes and steals money from the federal banking system. What do we mean by this? Quite simply, the Venezuelan economy is funding itself by taking its money from the citizens. That's really important because the citizens, right now, already suffering a huge economic crisis and about to face an even worse one, are facing starvation. They can barely pay for food. In fact, the New York Times reports that individuals are already skipping meals in order to survive. At a certain point, it is not acceptable for the United States to play games with their lives, to edge unstable dictators into a situation where they're forced to. The second thing we've seen is a prevention and stealing of aid. Now, we've seen this in Venezuela in the past, and we've seen it worldwide, both historically and today. But at the end of the day, if the Venezuelan government receives any benefit package meant for its citizens, it takes it away and uses it to fund its own economy. Third, it leads to other alternatives, such as rising taxes. Again, look to all the evidence. Judge, at the end of the day, the round's going to be like this. Sanctions don't work. They harm the economy. And they harm the people. With all that, I'm proud to affirm.
Excuse me, I'm going to ask them to quiet it down. I don't know if it's disturbing. Oh, they just left. I just have to get up.
Okay, if everyone is ready, just for a quick off-time roadmap, I want to talk a little bit about the background before I get into the negations case with our disadds, our counterplan, and then go back into the affirmations case. Is everyone ready?
How many disadds?
2. Okay, with that, I'd like to start my time now. We strongly negate the resolution that the USFG should lift all or most of its sanctions on Venezuela. Now, as the affirmative came up here, they gave us some background information. We agree with all of the net benefits and all of that and their plan. However, the background information, I do want to clarify a few things. Now, while it is true that the current president of Venezuela refuses to abdicate the power, that is not the cause of all United States sanctions. While that is the cause of some of the more recent ones, because the United States federal government is trying to get Maduro out of power, a lot of the United States sanctions have been imposed on Venezuela for much longer than he's been in power, and have actually nothing to do directly with his rule, and have more to do with the type of economy and the violence that goes on in the government of Venezuela, not just him, but the rest of the government. Okay, so with that, I'd like to go into my first disadvantage, is that there's too many good sanctions. So the affirmation comes up here and basically just says a bunch of facts, says a bunch of things, but doesn't actually give any facts. So, because I want to go into some of the sanctions that the United States has put on Venezuela that are actually extremely helpful and extremely beneficial. Because the affirmation comes up here and says that sanctions don't help, but that's simply not true. The first one is terrorism-related sanctions. So the U.S. has prohibited all U.S. commercial arms sales to and retransfers to Venezuela since 2006, right? So if the affirmations plan passes and they lift this sanction, that means the United States is now going to be allowed to sell commercial arms sales and retransfers to Venezuela, and we see that that's simply going to increase the amount of guns that are in the use of their terrorists and also their gangs. And we see that the reason that this was implemented in 2006 was because of all of the violence going on that from the terrorists and from the gang members. And we see that this is an example of yes.
Are there still any violence happening in Venezuela?
Yes, there is, but just because you don't see, like, okay, the sanctions are there and violence happens, right? But if you take away the sanctions, it would have been like much worse. Okay. Then I also want to go into drug trafficking, which is also an issue in Venezuela. And what the United States federal government has done is waived foreign aid. They've established the Foreign Act that stops a lot of the companies that have been involved in this corruption, and it puts sanctions on specific people involved in in the drug money laundering. So, for example, it actually stopped $2.4 billion from companies that were basically like money laundering to supply drugs to these cartels, and it basically took that money, it froze their assets. So we see that the United States is very efficient. Well, it is difficult because there's so much crime going on in Venezuela, it's impossible to stop it all, like when you're so far away. We do see that sanctions are beneficial, and by taking them all away, okay, the affirmation comes up here and argues that sanctions aren't beneficial at all. We're not arguing that they're solving all of the problems in status quo, but we're saying that they're solving a lot of issues that are going on, and if you just completely get rid of all sanctions, you're losing all of those benefits. I'll take your question at the end if I have time. So it's still first content. Okay. So some of the impacts is that it saves millions of dollars that are supposed to be going to drugs, and it stops a lot of the corruption going on in these companies, because we see a lot of times in people in positions of power use their political power, or they use the power that they have from being in their company to launder money and all of that. We also see one of the really important sanctions that the United States has placed is the anti-democratic action, human rights violation. So what they've done is they've imposed financial sanctions on over 80 companies that before the sanctions were imposed funded anti-democratic, basically they funded terrorist organizations, and they funded the drug cartels, and they funded organizations that were against democracy. So we see that by these sanctions, the Treasury monitors these companies, and they keep adding more and more companies to their list of sanctions. I'm sorry, I have a lot of time to get through, maybe at the end of this contention. So you see that they keep adding companies, that they put these financial they freeze their assets, so that money is then not able to go into these anti-democratic organizations and all of that. So we're seeing that these sanctions are very beneficial. Then I want to go into actually our second disadvantage is that the new sanctions on Maduro are really good. So the one that I want to talk about is in early March, the U.S. sanctioned a bank lending program to Maduro. And what they did is the U.S. Treasury sanctioned euros. It's called Euro Finance. And that was involved in setting up Maduro's cryptocurrency. So basically what they did is this was the bank that was funding a lot of them, they were basically paying Maduro, and that's how he was able to, even though he was able to basically go so Russia was giving him money, and that's how he was able to stay in power without actually getting support from the citizens, because right now none of the citizens support him, right? And however, he's able to maintain in power because he keeps getting money from Russia. I'm sorry, at the end, if I have time, I'll take all your questions. So we see that the impact of this is if we lift all sanctions, we're going to be lifting this relatively new sanction that's actually been proven that it is working, because we see that Maduro is actually losing a lot of the money and support, and obviously if he doesn't have money, he's going to lose the support from other politically powerful people in Venezuela. So we see that the impact of this is if you go through with the affirmations plan, we're basically going to be eliminating the chance that we have right now of actually taking Maduro out of power by ending the amount of money he has. And then, going into the affirmations plan, the first is that sanctions don't stop the government. Again, I already went into the fact that it doesn't mean that they don't help, right? It's extremely difficult to just take away all corruption going on in a country, right? Especially when the ruler is very bad. However, as I've already proven to you, you can cross-apply my first contention to my first DA to their first contention about how it is good. And again, about their second point about U.S. sanctions won't stop Venezuela because Venezuela gets money from Russia. Actually, the very new sanction that was just implemented that I just talked about is going to help that. And then their second contention is basically the same thing about sanctions don't help because all they talked about here were facts about the 26% economic collapse and that individuals are struggling. Well, I'm going to actually completely eliminate this contention with our CP that I'm going to cross apply to it. And our counter plan is that they're going to keep all of the sanctions on Venezuela other than the very new set of economic sanctions that the government put on the shipments of between Venezuela and Colombia. The oil shipments. So just recently the Trump administration passed new sanctions to try and basically freeze the Cuban and Venezuela shipments that have been happening. However, there's been, this actually has only been detrimentally affecting the actual people of Venezuela. So we see that while we do argue that all of the sanctions placed are good, this is actually the bad one that's causing all of the bad things that the affirmation cited. And my partner will go a little bit more into this, but basically all of the money that they're losing and the humanitarian crisis is happening because of this bill.
Yeah, but even so, these responses that keeps them out.
Alrighty, is everyone ready?
Yeah.
Good? Alright, great. Alright, hi, I'm trying to explain exactly why the United States federal government should be lifting, in this case, all of its sanctions on Venezuela. I'm going to start off talking about their counterplans. I have a lot I really want to say on it. Then I'm going to move on to their case, then I'm going to move on to the affirmative case. First off, on their counterplan. I have a lot of different issues with it. Some of them, ethical as far as debate, and some of them technical as far as the individual arguments. First off, on the technical parts of the debate, they tell you they want to get rid of all other sanctions except for new sanctions. That means every argument they brought up. Yeah.
I want to reread the counterplan. It was that we're going to lift the newest set of economic sanctions while keeping all the old sanctions.
Okay, lift the newest set while keeping the.
No, we're only lifting the one set of economic sanctions related to oil. We're keeping every other sanction I talked about.
I understand what they're saying. Problem is, if they're lifting any sanctions at all, they're conceding to the idea that sanctions don't work, because otherwise there'd be no reason to lift them. So that's a reason to buy into the affirmative case at all. If you're lifting any sanctions, it's because you agree they don't work. But there are also just some other issues, just as far as debate, how debate should operate, where I have issues with their case, and I think there's unique reasons to vote them down. First off, they literally introduced their counterplan in the last 30 seconds of their speech. That's uniquely harmful debate because counterplans and plans are the crux of how debate works. They're literally the framework for all arguments brought up in the round, and you should be bringing them up in the top of the case because because you're limiting the amount of time I have to respond to what's literally the most important argument. Remember, counterplans and plans are the framework for debate. Brought them for this because it should have been brought up earlier. Also, they're running a specific type of counterplan called a counterplan minus or pick minus. Those types of counterplans are counterplans where they basically do what the affirmative wants to do, except one minor thing. That's really bad for debate because you're basically just co-opting the affirmative position and then trying to do something smart with it that makes it difficult for the affirmative to argue because you're just trying to steal out impacts that's uniquely bad for debate. Anyways, those are just unique reasons to vote them down. Keep them in mind. I hope they won't end up mattering. Anyway, moving on to the specific disadvantages which they brought up. First one, they said there are good sanctions. A few things on this. First off, sanctions might be well-intentioned, but it doesn't mean that they work. My partner gave you a bunch of analysis why sanctions don't work. They didn't respond to any of the specific analysis or links that my partner gave as to why sanctions don't work. All they said was, yes, they do, and tried to give examples, but without responding to the specific analysis that my partner gave and all of the, as to use their own words, facts that my partner brought up, you need to be buying the idea that sanctions don't work. Remember what my partner said. The right quote was that sanctions have a poor track record at best. They don't work. Second off, even if that wasn't true, we know that Russia's just going to be supplying them with this type of thing anyway. So even if in theory sanctions did work, in this case they won't be because we know Russia's just going to be going forward with it anyway. So it won't be helping anything. It won't be helping anyone at all. Third off, sanctions just hurt the people. This is what my partner said. I'll get into why they tried to refute it. I'll get into a little bit why they do hurt the people later on. But remember, if at the end of the day you have sanctions to cause change, and you have that change because you want to have a good outcome, but you're not. But like, if you want to have sanctions to end up with a good outcome, then why are you using a method which causes people to suffer? That's counter to the reason you want the sanctions in the first place. Now moving on to their second contention.
So on this, they gave 3 examples: terrorism, drug trafficking, and like paramilitary groups. Except while the sanctions were imposed were good, trying to solve something good, they weren't effective. Like war on drugs still exists.
Yeah, like, and all these things, just like before I move on to the second contention, just keep in mind, if these sanctions were imposed, just remember they're still happening, they're still existing in the squad. Like, I gotta ask them, is there still violence in Venezuela? They go, yes. This is the proof that they're not working. They admit to it. Anyways, moving on to their second contention. There's a lot of different issues I have with their second contention. The biggest one is that it fails to understand why Maduro is still in power and why sanctions don't actually stop. Like, specifically, that it doesn't stop Maduro from staying in power. The reason Maduro is still in power is because he has support of the generals. Yeah.
What are you doing to get Maduro out of power then?
We're not doing anything to help Maduro. That's not our advocacy. But their advocacy doesn't help with that either for the reasons I'm about to list. In fact, they make the situation in Venezuela worse. My partner and I don't have to solve for Maduro being in power. We just have to prove that, like, you should be lifting the sanctions. It's not our advocacy. Anyways, why is Maduro still in power despite what Juan Guaido did in invoking his power to become the new leader of Venezuela? It's because Maduro has made friends with and has put the generals in the military in high positions. Maduro has command over the military. No economic sanctions on anybody is going to change that. They don't do anything in their counterplan or anything in this round to address the friendship Maduro has with the people in high political positions that are generals in the military. It's the military power that is allowing Maduro to stay in control. They don't do anything to solve that. Therefore, for all the other reasons sanctions don't work anyways, in this specific case they don't work because they don't address the reason why Maduro is still in power. Yeah.
Also, Maduro is still in power, even though we've implemented these sanctions.
Also, Maduro, like proof, Maduro is still in power. We've implemented sanctions before. This just, I mean, that's what it is. Also, remember, Russia's just going to be helping him out anyways. Like, there's just no way. Like, the crux of this whole round is basically going to be sanctions don't help anything. Therefore, they just makes things worse. So there's no reason to vote for them. That'll be made more clear. All right, now moving on to the affirmative case. Our first contentions: sanctions don't work. I mean, there's not a ton for me to say here. My partner gives you, to quote them, a bunch of facts as to why sanctions don't work, and they don't respond to any of the specific analysis given. Judge, let me be very clear. Sanctions don't work. They concede to that, meaning all they're doing is opium.
Extend like this specific analysis, like how over time the countries tend to use other changes.
Like remember what my partner said about how over time countries will adapt to these sanctions. Like, how over time countries will adapt to these sanctions. We know we've had sanctions there for a long time. There's no way it makes sense that they've been working. If they've been there for a long time and no changes happened, then they're obviously not working. And they just drop all of my partner's analysis, meaning you're buying the idea that there's no reason to keep the sanctions in place, meaning there's only theoretical benefits to actually lifting them. Okay, moving on to our second contention. Again, they really just don't give a lot of analysis as to why this isn't true. Yeah.
What is the specific benefit of lifting the sanctions?
Everything in my second contention about how it hurts the people. And even if my partner and I can't provide you anything as to why it would be good to lift the sanctions, we've still proven that sanctions don't work. So that means the only thing that's left is potential benefits, even if my partner and I can't articulate them, because there's no good reason to keep them in.
But we do articulate them, like the 26% and the...
Yeah, but either way, my partner and I do bring them up in the second contention. I'll get to that in a moment. Like, they basically just don't provide an outline. Like, they don't deal with what my partner is actually talking about all the evidence my partner brought up about how sanctions just lead to increased inequality because for one reason, it leads the government to just steal money from the bank, from their bank. It just causes the government to take the food aid. It just causes an increase in taxes, which negatively impacts the people, which leads to higher inequality, which leads to death. Remember the quote that my partner gave you, which they never refuted, which is that this new round of which is that these tariffs, which are wanting to be implemented on all these different things, would lead to a 26% decrease in the Venezuelan economy, equivalent to an economic collapse, which leads to death 100% of the time. What? And this is all happening. Like, okay, so just overview on everything real quick. Sanctions don't work. They drop all of my partner's analysis, meaning that just leads to harms. And even if you don't buy our articulated harms, because you're buying that sanctions don't work, you're buying there's theoretical benefits. My partner and I may or may not do. But we do.
Okay, so I'm gonna go over. Okay, just like a general overview of what I like the debate, and then I'm gonna go into CP and then neg DAs. Yeah. Okay.
Anything, anywhere particular you want
And then
for the overview?
No, it's just gonna be in general.
Okay.
Okay, so start my time now. Okay, so my name is Shreya Agrawal, and I'll be the second speaker of the negation. So what this round is going to come down to is which side is better going to solve for the humanitarian crisis in Venezuela. So we see that this humanitarian crisis, both sides have agreed that the humanitarian crisis is bad, but which side is going to solve better? And also, we're also going to be looking at, basically the Venezuelan citizens themselves. So if, as a negation, if we can provide you any way in which we are going to uniquely be like helping the Venezuelan citizens, then you should be voting for us over the affirmation. So going straight into this. So going into the counterplan. So the counterplan is specifically the United States federal government will lift the newest set of economic sanctions against the government of Venezuela related to shipments of oil between Venezuela and Cuba. So we see that my partner actually ran out of time when she was talking about this. We see that these sanctions, these recent sanctions that have been placed on Venezuela and the Venezuelan government have actually been, Trump has been placing these in response in trying to punish Maduro for these human rights violations. However, we see that this specific set of economic sanctions has had basically poor impacts on the citizens themselves, because we see that Venezuela has gotten help from Russia in order to solve this, as the affirmation was stating in their previous speech, and also it has led to a decrease in the economy of the Venezuelan government or Venezuelan economy itself. So we see that this sanction has actually been uniquely harmful to the Venezuelan people. However, also this was that statistic that they brought up, the 26% decrease in the economy when we were looking it up. Yes.
So what makes this sanction specifically different from all the ones you mentioned, in that this sanction has all the harms that we discussed, but none of the others?
Okay, so basically what's happening is that this sanction was specifically placed in response to Maduro's presidency. The sanction was specifically placed basically in order to decrease Maduro's power, and take away his role and force him to abdicate. However, these old sanctions, like the ones in 2006, clearly weren't placed for that. This new leader, we haven't really brought this up, but Juan Guaido, he's basically the new leader that the Venezuelan people are supporting, and the United States is supporting as well. He's only been recently trying to get into power in the past couple of months. So we see that these new sanctions, which have occurred in the past couple of months, have actually been solely in order to get rid of Maduro. So this is the unique difference between the newer sanctions as compared to the older sanctions relating to drug trafficking as well as terrorism. Yeah, so we see that this sanction itself is actually going to be bad, and that's why as a CP we're going to be removing this. Some of their responses to the CP are that we're conceding that sanctions don't work. However, we're only conceding that we're saying that this set of sanctions is bad. And again, I already made that distinction. Next, I talk about how the CP was introduced in the last 30 seconds. However, the CP was introduced in the first neg speech, so it wasn't introduced in the second neg speech. It would be abusive if we did that. However, and they never ran a T-shell or anything. So we see that this this doesn't really matter. Next, I talk about how it's a pig. But we see it's very different. We're not actually going to be affirming the resolution because we're not lifting all or most of the sanctions. We're only lifting one set of specific sanctions. Next, going on into the DA. So our DA was about these sanctions, that there's too many good sanctions. Basically went unrefuted. They talked about how sanctions basically don't work, but they didn't talk about when we see drug trafficking. They stopped $2.4 billion of companies from laundering drugs. So we see that drugs are really detrimental. And in the affirmations world, if you're going to be lifting all of these sanctions, you're going to see more drugs entering Venezuela. So in the end, you're going to be seeing more drugs reaching these impoverished people, and which is, again, we can see clearly detrimental to Venezuelan citizens, and the affirmation has no solvency whatsoever for this. They're simply allowing this to happen. Next, terrorism related. We see that the U.S. in 2006, they prohibited all these arms sales to Venezuela. And we see that Venezuela has large violence presence as well as presence of gangs, terrorism and gangs. And these terrorism gangs, they've gotten weapons from other countries illegally or that. But if we lift these U.S. sanctions, it's going to be so much easier. So although their only response was that the sanctions, the problems are still there, so the sanctions aren't working. But we see that just because we see okay, this is just an example I thought of, but just because if racism is present doesn't mean that the amendment freeing slavery wasn't necessary. Just because the problem isn't completely gone doesn't mean that getting rid of, like, allowing slavery again is going. Okay, sorry, that was a bad example. But yeah, so you see that this whole argument about the problem still present doesn't mean that it's going, yeah. The whole, like, isn't a good, it's like not enough of a response, because we see that once drug trafficking and the terrorism related bans are lifted, we're going to see an increase in weapon sales, which leads to an increase in violence as well as an increase in drug trafficking. Yes.
Can you tell me which U.S. company is going to be selling weapons to terrorists, as you're saying in your contention?
Well, it's not companies selling to terrorists. It's just selling them to Venezuela, and Venezuela has a history of giving them to or selling them to these terrorist groups. Basically, any U.S. company selling to Venezuela itself. Next, okay, so that was the first DA. The next DA was about some of the other sanctions like that were good, and the United States recently placed, it wasn't recently, but like a year ago or something, they placed this sanction on banks, on this Russian bank, Evron Finance, and it was basically involved in setting up Nicolas Maduro's cryptocurrency, and was helped support his campaign. And we see that it is because of this, is now a risk for countries all around the world to do business with Venezuelan banks simply because of the sanctions. So Maduro's power is actually decreasing, and just because he isn't out of power yet doesn't mean that the sanction is ineffective. So we see that this sanction is actually was actually effective in decreasing their power. And although and this is specifically against Russia's Evron Finance Bank. So we see that this is actually going to be helping solve this issue about Maduro, and we're decreasing Maduro's power in the negations counterplan negations world, while the affirmation is simply going to be getting rid of all of these. Next, going on to the affirmations case, their first contention was about how sanctions do not do anything to curb government abuse. But first of all, they said we didn't respond. My partner, basically, you can cross-apply everything that my partner said, and that's what she said. But also, we see that in any time, the United States sanctions have been solving for terrorism, the violence, as well as solving for drug trafficking. We're seeing we saw a decrease in drug trafficking, as well as a decrease in violence, although these might still be present. I'll take a question at the end if I have time. So this whole idea about sanctions bad, and they say countries are going to adapt to sanctions, and first of all, adapting to sanctions, okay, sure, maybe they'll adapt to sanctions, but the affirmation provides no better way. They're basically saying, oh, we'll just get rid of sanctions, so we'll allow all weapons instead of maybe a little it'll be less effective, but instead they're allowing all weapons to be sold. So we see that this is actually going to be ineffective. The affirmation isn't solving for this. Even if this idea is true, that sanctions are countries will adapt, that doesn't mean that the affirmation is solving for this. So you're still voting on the negation in this. Next, we talk about Russia spilling in on U.S. sanctions. So look to the DA that we see that there's that new sanction that was good, that Evron Finance, in which U.S. actually decreased Russian influence and decreased Maduro's power. Next, they talk about how sanctions don't solve and they make it worse. First of all, they're only statistics. This 26% decrease in economy. We read the same New York Times article, and we see that this is only in response to this oil sanction, which our counterplan is going to be getting rid of. So that evidence doesn't stand. Okay, so with that, I urge a strong ballot for the negation.
Okay. Sorry. Okay, if everyone's ready, I'll start my time now. Before I go into the specific points of this case, I want to just make something very clear. I want to give an example. The United States gives a lot of money to people who are in low income or don't have jobs or don't have money and stuff like that, right? But there's still homeless people, and there's still people who are poor in this country, right? So what I'm trying to say is, just because the United States is helping, but there's no not every single person has enough money to be in a home, doesn't mean that the aid they're giving them isn't helping them, right? So that was just what I wanted to use to basically go against your whole point, is that sanctions aren't solving for terrorism, and sanctions aren't solving for economic struggles, and sanctions aren't solving for like the drug cartels, because Venezuela is a crime-ridden country, and some sanctions aren't going to completely get rid of all of it, but there's so many benefits in each of the different sanctions I talked about that getting rid of it would literally only provide harms. So for instance, I gave like 4 different examples and none of them were refuted. Like the part about drug trafficking, the part about terrorist-related arms, like the only like one refutation they had is like, oh, what American company is going to sell arms to Venezuela? Like number one, it's about like they're not going to sell them directly to terrorists, they sell them to Venezuela, and like they've recently been doing with the U.S. shipments of food, like the terrorists can like sometimes like take control or like hijack like the trucks and stuff like that. And anyway, there's like a million different ways that if the United States starts selling to Venezuela, like people will, like more terrorists will get like guns like in their hands. But that's not even the point. The point is that when you look at the two sides, the affirmation and the the affirmation has no benefits whatsoever. Other than the 2 points that they say that sanctions don't help, like what benefit, like there's no benefits whatsoever. They just say that they don't help when they don't take into consideration all of the other things that they're stopping, right? Just because they're not solving doesn't mean they're stopping. The only one like statistic they have is about the economic collapse, and that is like directly refuted by our counterplan, because the only economic collapse happening like recently in Venezuela is because of oil, because Venezuela oil is basically their whole economy. And when the United States put the shipment on Venezuelan, Colombian like oil, like when they put the economic sanctions on that, that's when we saw the decrease in the economy. But that's completely refuted by our counterplan, and I just want to like go over some like first things. Like it was like I did bring up the counterpoint late in my speech, however I read through my whole counterplan and I like gave examples so that there was nothing stopping the affirmation from having enough time to respond to it, because I went through my whole content and my whole counterplan. And then the part about how like we're not like being topical because it's like we're not affirming the affirmation. Like again, the resolution is that like the lift all or most sanctions on Venezuela. So by simply lifting one and keeping all of the other ones, we're still arguing that most sanctions are good. So we do have like direct counter positions to the affirmation. So then going over that, basically if you vote for the negation, you keep all of the pros that are provided by the sanctions, and such as the Russia's the sanctions on the bank, the sanctions that stop human trafficking, the sanctions that help the drugs, and the sanctions that are terrorism related. Whereas if you vote for the affirmation, like you just agree that like some sanctions are bad, but nothing is actually like going to happen. And again, I just want to point out that like in terms of like net benefits, you want to talk about lives, and the only people who are actually helping lives is the negation, because by making these small changes with all of our sanctions, we're helping terrorism, we're helping drugs, we're helping funnel money away from the bad parts of Venezuela, and we're helping the economy. And for those reasons, please vote for the negation. Thank you.
I'm going to first address the easiest way to decide this round, then I'll go onto the counterplan, onto the negation case, onto the affirmation case, and finally tie up this round, weigh it, crystallize it, and make sure it's as easy to judge as possible. Does that make sense?
Sounds good.
Awesome. Judge, the easiest way to decide this round can be summed up in one question. Why do you think Venezuela currently has its worst economic crisis it's ever had? Let's get into the counterplan first. The counterplan tells you that we should keep all sanctions except for those brand new ones, because those brand new ones are bad. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but my partner tells you that this counterplan is unfair because it's quite literally carving out some of our ground. It's being used as a strategy to say, we'll take all the good parts of the AF plan and make them non-unique, so we don't have to debate about them. We're only going to debate about the parts that you think are bad. Unfortunately, that's a huge strategy scheme. I can't take the good parts of the negative case, for instance, that one sanction that they mentioned, and say, hey, I think that's good, now we're advocating for it. It's something that's non-reciprocal. That's what my partner was trying to address. At the end of the day, however, I still think the affirmation wins, with or without the counterplan. Next on the counterplan. They concede here that the new sanctions don't work, that the new sanctions are causing some sort of economic harm or harm on the people. But that brings up a very important question. Why is the sanction causing harm right now? They tell you, in their second speech, they attempt to tell you that, well, because the sanction was put to limit Madero. But the intentions of a sanction don't cause an effect. The actual sanction causes an effect. And what about the sanction harms the economy? What about the sanction harms the people? Well, look to the 7 minutes I spent talking about that. First of all, the sanction isn't effective in that it just pushes the Venezuelan economy to new trade routes instead of closing other ones. Second, the new sanctions, just the same as the old, push the government to remake the money it has lost. I mean, they can see that with the 26% idea of what harm to the economy might we see. What they fail to realize is that we've already seen that happen from past sanctions. Remember, again, as I said, the very first thing in my speech, Venezuela right now is suffering the largest economic crisis it has ever had. Almost its entire 30 million population is feeling the effects, with millions having already had to flee the country or reduce meals just to be able to afford enough food to feed their family. That isn't new. That's what life is like right now. And at the end of the day, what caused that? Maybe it wasn't totally responsible, but the United States certainly didn't help. Next, let's address the negation case. The negation case relies on this idea that, well, some sanctions have done some good in the past, therefore we shouldn't remove them. There's a couple of responses that they concede, and a couple of logical flaws that prevent you from voting for the negation for this reason. First and foremost, as my partner says, this stuff has already happened. We're not preventing new weapon sales because all those weapon contracts have already ended. We're not shutting down new companies because it's the same companies that have had their assets frozen for the entire time. Those companies are already gone. Those weapon contracts are already gone.
This whole analysis about how these companies and weapon contracts are already gone and won't be come again is new information that was.
My partner literally says that these were even if these worked in the past, they're not doing anything in the status quo. And even if it wasn't that, I'm cross-applying arguments that I made on my specific case, talking about how sanctions right now. Huh? Okay, I'll resume in time now. But Judge, if you didn't want to vote on the argument, you can simply vote on the status quo. As my partner tells you, their drug trafficking sanction hasn't stopped the flow of drugs into the United States. In fact, the United States is suffering its worst opioid crisis, reaching a point where, as reported by U.S. News, you're about 2 times more likely to die from your own hand, such as a drug overdose, than from another individual. Terrorism and violence still exist in Venezuela. They like to tell you, well, it's reduced now. How much? By how much has these sanctions reduced? What's the numerical amount that they've prevented? Because I can tell you right now that the economy, the effect of previous sanctions, has collapsed their economy, put 30 million people at risk of starvation, forced over 1 million to flee their homes, and overall is about to cause the collapse of an entire country. That's factual. That's backed up by Yang Lee of Stanford University, the New York Times, CNN, and The Independent, all as I discussed in my first speech. On their second contention is ridiculous because Madero is still in power and they concede the articulation that my partner makes about why he's in power. So let's do the final impact weighing, right? Let's take the negation at their best. That sanctions right now, from a decade ago, are still stopping terrorism, are still stopping drug trafficking, and are still preventing foreign paramilitaries. Judge, none of that justifies the sacrificing of millions of individuals. Remember, these sanctions are the root cause of an economic crisis, just as Yang Lee told you. It's the reason why Madero has been pushed to oppress his country, taking away funds from the citizens who need it. And at the end of the day, under a net beneficial world, as I tell you in my first speech, you can't sacrifice their lives for our ideals. With that, I strongly affirm.